Welcome. Our topic for today is photosynthesis. We're going to be looking at how plants use this to create food, which in turn is used for energy. As we go through these notes, you're going to see some words on my screen that are underlined. These will be words that you would be looking to fill in on your end on the handout you've been provided. So slide 1, some review that we should know before we get any further with photosynthesis. I'll kind of tie to the food chain. The sun isn't really part of the food chain, but it's being represented to show that plants use it to create energy, which would make them a producer because they can make their own energy. Crickets and frogs, on the other hand, they cannot make their own energy, so they are called consumers. We have primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. The whole purpose of eating in the food chain is to attain energy, which is defined as the ability to do work. We'll be looking at energy on our next slide briefly. We looked at food chains. We can see this food chain has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trophic levels. It shows the order of energy transfer from organism to organism. And very recently, we just learned about glucose, which is a sugar that is stored in our body, but then broken apart when we need to use energy. So looking at photosynthesis, this is a process that plants use. They use the energy from the sunlight ultimately to create glucose, which is a sugar, and this glucose can be used for energy. Energy, once again, being defined as the ability to do work. That would include things like growing, repairing damage to a plant, reproducing, and other things. So looking at sunlight and energy. When we look at the sunlight, I would describe the sunlight as having a white color. I don't know that it really has a color at all, but I would describe it as having a white color. And we also already know that in the sunlight, there's all the colors of the rainbow. Well, how are those colors able to actually be seen? Well, they have to be separated in order to be seen. When they're blended together, we have that white sunlight. So what allows them to have the ability to be separated and make a rainbow? The answer to that question is that all the colors in the sunlight have a different wavelength. And we see wavelengths on our screen right here. A wavelength is measured from the top of one peak to the top of the next peak. However far that distance is, that's one wavelength. Looking at the different colors of the rainbow here, we can see that each of them has a unique wavelength. Violet, for example, is 400 nanometers. Very, very small. Red, 665 nanometers. Still really, really small, but much, much bigger than 400 nanometers. This difference in wavelength allows colors to be separated from one another when we look at light, say, through a prism. Or when there's water moisture in the air and sunlight shines through it, we can also see them separated at that point. The ability of these colors to be separated from one another becomes an important part of photosynthesis, which we'll learn about a little bit later on. The next item that we have to become familiar with are pigments. As we see on the screen here, pigments determine what color something is. When we're looking at anything, like these paints, this green one here for example, this paint has pigments that absorb all the colors in sunlight, except for green. Because green is not absorbed by the pigments in this paint, it's reflected, just like your reflection bouncing off a mirror. It doesn't get soaked into the mirror, it gets bounced off. So going back to our previous slide, we can see all these colors. All these colors are hitting that paint that we just looked at on the previous slide. All of the colors get soaked into the paint because the paint has pigments that will absorb them. So there's pigments to absorb the purple, the blue, the indigo, the yellow, the orange, the red. But there's not a pigment for green. Because green is not absorbed by this paint, it's reflected off. Now, how do we see this as the color green? Well, we just mentioned that light is reflected off of the paint. That light goes into your eye. and we perceive the color green. This would apply to literally everything around us that has color. Everything has pigments. Those pigments will absorb some light, but it will reflect other light. That allows us to see the chairs in my classroom as being blue, maybe the shirt you're wearing as being yellow, so on and so forth. Plants have a pigment too. That pigment is called chlorophyll. And there's two types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and there's chlorophyll B. This pigment ultimately captures sunlight and uses it for energy in the process of photosynthesis to make glucose. So now that we understand a little bit about sunlight and pigments, let's look at the parts of a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are special parts of plant cells, and this is where photosynthesis actually happens. These are very, very small, and they're located inside of a cell. So imagine how small a cell is, and this chloroplast is considerably smaller than that. One cell will have many of these chloroplasts, so there's not just one of these per cell. In a chloroplast, there's a couple different parts, but there's only three that we need to be familiar with, and those are the thylakoids, the granum, and the stroma. The chlorophyll that we just mentioned is contained within the thylakoid. Those are these little pancakes here. Each one of those is a thylakoid. They contain chlorophyll. This would be where sunlight is absorbed in a plant, is right in these thylakoids. Now granum is a stack of those thylakoids. So this entire thing is one granum. We have another granum over here, another granum over here, all consisting of stacks of thylakoids. And lastly, we have the stroma. The stroma is this space out here that surrounds the granum and the thylakoids. It's a liquid, and it kind of helps fill the chloroplast. These three parts will be mentioned when we start looking at the process of photosynthesis. So what exactly is photosynthesis? Well, here's the chemical equation for photosynthesis. If you're not familiar with chemical equations just yet, don't be too concerned about it. What we need to know, though, are that there are two sides in a chemical equation. There's the before, and then there's the after. So how this is actually read would be right down here. 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 molecules of water will make, which is what this arrow is indicating, 1 glucose and 6 oxygens. Now this is an understood 1 because there is not a number before this first 6 here. If there's not a number, it's understood that it's a 1. If it's anything other than a 1, like this oxygen here, that number will be indicated right before it. So this is an equation that we're going to need to take into consideration when we're talking about how photosynthesis actually operates very shortly. But what I want you to know right now is that it's kind of like cooking. We need to mix things together, and then we get totally different products after we've done the baking. In chemical equations, the side before the arrow, these are called the reactants. They react together. The side after the arrow, those are called the products. They are produced as a result of this chemical equation taking place. Photosynthesis does not happen all at once. It happens in two different stages, the light-dependent stage and then the light-independent stage. They also happen in two different parts of the chloroplast. We previously spoke of thylakoids and the stroma. The light-dependent reactions, these happen inside the thylakoids, and that kind of makes sense because that's where the chlorophyll is, and that's what absorbs light. So if we take away light, then this part of the reaction would not work at all. We completely shut down. The stroma is where the light-independent reactions take place. In other words, light is not used to actually get this part of photosynthesis going. However, without the light, the entire process would shut down entirely, as we'll see on our next slide right here. So you're going to have this image in your notes. You're going to want to take a second to get this filled in, and then we'll start talking about it. So looking at this image, we can see that it's split down the middle. One side is for the light-dependent reactions, the other side is labeled as the Kelvin cycle, which is another name for the light-independent reactions. I tend to use the word Kelvin cycle, not light-independent reactions, so you'll hear that as we move forward. What we see right here is step 1, light going into a chloroplast, and it's striking the thylakoids, which has chlorophyll. As light is striking the thylakoids, being captured by the chlorophyll, we can see that the 6 molecules of water are also entering the thylakoids, and ADP is entering the thylakoids as well. Using the energy from the sunlight, these ingredients are transformed. As a result, 6 molecules of oxygen are produced, and ADP is converted into ATP, which we know is usable energy. Once these are produced, they leave the thylakoids and they exit into the stroma, which is our third step. Additionally, with ATP, we have the hydrogens from water that are exiting as well. With the ATP and the hydrogens in the stroma, that allows the Kelvin cycle to operate. So the Kelvin cycle actually needs the ATP right here, this energy, in order to actually work. Take away the ATP, the Kelvin cycle shuts down entirely. With the ATP out in the stroma, that allows the carbon dioxides to enter the equation, combine with the hydrogens from over here to produce sugars. As a result of sugars being made and the ATP being used, ADP is released as a waste product. So here's kind of what I was just talking about in words. The Kelvin cycle, once again, is using the energy from ATP, taking in the carbon dioxide and the hydrogens from over here, mixing them up like a cake, making glucose and ADP. And once ADP is formed, it goes back over to the thylakoids, and we're back at step 1, begins all over again. This concludes our discussion on photosynthesis. Make sure you double check some of the questions that you were answering as you were going through this video, and we'll talk about this again in class.